We are back again at the Multicultural Center to talk to Mr. Ramdas Sankara. He is the president of the Ethnic Community Council of Western Australia. He will be sharing his opinion about multiculturalism, terrorism, hate speech, and most importantly, the incident that took place in New Zealand last week.
There's been a lot of dog whistling going on, from our political and leaders, and indeed vested interests in the media, trying to divide us on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of faith, and unfortunately, the religion that has copped most of it has been Islam. This wasn't the case when I first came to the country back in the late 70s. People of Jewish background and indeed Asians, particularly Chinese, copped it sweet from the Jack Van Tongerens of the world. We have replaced the racism, the vilification and the racial abuse and hatred in the latter part of the last century to the beginning of this century with Islam at the forefront. We're looking elsewhere for the so-called enemy, if I can use that word, whereas what we have now found out is that it is within us, not outside of us, but within us. Indeed, he was what we call a mainstream Australians, not the sort of people that unfortunately the government of the day has been blaming in recent times in terms of the so-called threat to our nation. This is something that we need to come to terms with. And we cannot come to terms with this unless and until we first and foremost be comfortable with our identity. Identity as a people, identity as a nation. And this is where I think, we've got a long way to go. Hate mongering is unfortunately the worst weapon of mass destruction the world has known. All of it comes back to one word, and that is hatred. Pathological hatred. Indigenous people have been in Australia for 120,000 years. Now, as we well know, non-Indigenous population of this country started just over 200 years ago. In other words, just about 1.5% of the history of this nation is attributable to people of non-Indigenous background. And yet when it comes to identity as a nation, where do we bring our Indigenous people in? Evidence or recent incidents are highlighting the issue of so-called white supremacy. We are now using the words of white, right-wing extremist, and that encapsulates what our White Australia policy was. Major things that are missing now as a nation is first and foremost to have a Multiculturalism Act. And once we have that legislation in place, then we need to look at mechanisms, a national anti-racism strategy, a national language services policy, a national policy on substantive equality. Then we will stop doing what we unfortunately have been doing for decades. Things like racial profiling. So I think it's important that we look at religious discrimination and ensure that the Racial Discrimination Act is extended to cover the vilification and the persecution that we have seen, particularly in recent times, people of Islamic background. We talk about terror, and terror is, at the end of the day, in very simple terms, fear of what can happen to people when they're least expected. That's what sets terror aside from other things. When dressed in a hijab is walking innocently on the road, and the same would apply of people of African background. If we continue to criticize the community as criminals, how do they go about their life with dignity that they are entitled to like the rest of us? When we stereotype people the way our politicians and media interests have been doing, in a way we are engaging in a form of terrorism. Unless we learn to respect, to accept each other, and convey that not just in words, in action. It comes back in terms of equity. We have to end alienation. We have to end exclusion. We seek to make this an inclusive society, to remind them that limitless freedom of speech is not in anybody's interest, and limitless, particularly when it comes to hatred. Perpetuation of hatred, there is no place for that in civil societies like Australia.
I am Tony ETC reporting for Undercurrents.